I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, as the Munich Security Conference tops a critical diplomatic week for Ukraine, we examine the latest political manoeuvres, talk to the UN Senior Mine Action Advisor in Ukraine, and hear the latest on the underground war being waged in the occupied territories.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 14th of February, 2 years and 350 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley. I started with the military updates from Russia and Ukraine. First off, a Russian drone has struck the vast protective shell covering the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. President Zelensky said the attack drone had hit the concrete shelter that contains the remains of reactor number 4, which exploded in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. The International Atomic Energy Agency has confirmed that a UAV, an unmanned or uninhabited air vehicle, a drone, you and me, had hit the shelter's roof, causing an explosion. And they reported their on-site team had heard an explosion near the new safe confinement structure at around 2 a.m. local time. I'll talk about what that is a little bit later. Now, footage on social media shows the moment of impact and explosion, and cameras from inside the shelter captured an automatic fire suppression system being deployed, spraying water everywhere to combat the fire. Mr. Zelensky said the shelter at the Chernobyl NPP, that's a nuclear power plant, was damaged by this drone. The fire has been extinguished. As of now, radiation levels have not increased and are being constantly monitored. According to initial assessments, the damage to this shelter is significant. This is a terrorist threat to the entire world. The only country in the world that attacks such sites, occupies nuclear power plants and wages war without regard for the consequences is today's Russia. Ukraine's energy minister, Herman Elishenko, said Ukraine is urging the international community to urgently intensify efforts in response to Russia's unprecedented act of nuclear terrorism. The attack on the shelter of the 4th power unit at Chernobyl poses a threat to the entire continent. Now, Ukrainian media has released pictures of the drone's engine, which appeared to be from an Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drone. The strike damaged the concrete structure over the remnants of reactor number 4, but did not increase radiation levels, according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. That was where President Zelensky was quoting earlier. Now, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl, the site of the world's worst nuclear accident, is covered by a massive steel shelter to prevent radiation leaks. It was initially covered with a quick effort in 1986, but then another shell, this protective shell over it at the moment, was moved into place in 2016 following a huge construction project. That's designed to minimise the release of residual radioactivity from the reactor into the atmosphere. That structure covers both the reactor and the unstable sarcophagus, that first one that Soviet authorities built in 1986. And it was that outer shell that was hit and damaged by the drone last night. Quite a message to send on the eve of the Munich Security Conference. Now, on the ground inside Russia and Ukraine, no move except for a very small advancement to the north, basically in the vicinity of Velika-Novosilka, 50 k's-ish southwest of Pokrovsk. Elsewhere, Luke Pollard, Britain's Minister for the Armed Forces, has led an international trade delegation to Ukraine. The visit, which included Norway and the Netherlands, met with Ukrainian ministers, officials and industry partners, defence industry partners. Luke Pollard said the UK is continuing to lead the way on global support for Ukraine by strengthening defence industry ties with allies. We are providing Ukraine with the firepower it needs on the battlefield, whilst bolstering our own defence industrial base, creating jobs and driving investment. Our partnerships with the Netherlands, Norway and Ukraine will help build resilient supply chains to ensure we put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to achieve a just and lasting peace through strength. We will stand with our allies to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Now, he was doing all right until that last bit, for as long as it takes bit. This press release came out last night, and I should say MOD staff that put it together clearly doing their bit for the environment, because the note that came out last night recycled paragraphs from a press release that came out on Wednesday about the latest UK military aid package. That's the one about the £150 million for refurbed T-72s, drones and other stuff, if you're listening, chaps. Now, more details of the military aid pledge that this week's Ukraine Defence Contact Group, the Ramstein Group, has come to light. Germany is going to supply 100 IRIS-T air defence missiles. So IRIS-T stands for Infrared Imaging System Tail/Thrust Vector Controlled. Essentially, they are heat seekers going after the hottest part of a fighter jet. That's going to be the engine. Now, the term describes a family of short-range infrared homing air-to-air and short to medium range surface to air missiles. The tail and /thrust vector controlled is another way of guiding it to its target, basically. Now, also announced, Norway has joined the Ukrainian drone coalition and said it will establish and equip Ukraine's Northern Brigade as part of a broader Nordic initiative in which Nordic countries will equip and train one Ukrainian battalion each. Interesting new development. The Netherlands pledged 25 armoured infantry vehicles, the YPR variant. Latvia promised 42 armoured personnel carriers. The basic difference being an armoured infantry vehicle is designed to get you in the fight and stay there and see you through the position. An armoured personnel carrier is a battle taxi. Basically, it's designed to get you to the fight, drop you off, and then get the hell out of there. So much less well armoured and will have a smaller gun on it. But they're essentially big green boxes covered in metal. Now, Estonia also said it would allocate 0.25% of its GDP for military assistance to Ukraine in 2025. That's the plan, or that's the plan I keep talking about with Estonia. They suggest that European NATO nations, if they pledged 0.25% of GDP to Ukraine for 4 years, that would give Ukraine enough money to spend and plan over 4 years. So Estonia is leading the way there in year. Some of that reporting is from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War. Now, also announced at the Ukraine Defence Contact Group was that German defence company Helsing is going to send 6,000 artificial intelligence equipped drones to Ukraine. Gumbert Scherf, who's the co-founder of Helsing, said, "We are scaling up production of HX2, not HS2, don't worry about that, in response to additional orders from Ukraine where precision mass is offsetting a numerical disadvantage in legacy systems." Now, I don't read that out just as a press release from the company, because of course they're going to say it's brilliant, but these drones, especially with the AI-equipped drones, are thought to be very capable. The next thing we're going to see. But also the fact that he mentions their precision mass, I think that's very interesting. So rather than buying what's often referred to as exquisite kit, so small numbers of really expensive stuff, F-35A coming in at $80 million a pop, F-35B just over $100 million, very, very expensive. Can you afford to lose them, etc., etc. So a lot of thinking now saying that affordable mass, cheaper, maybe one-trick ponies sort of thing, not the ponies that Russia's using in Kursk, but actual, sort of things that only have one job but are cheap and you can use them and it doesn't matter if they get shot down. That seems to be a very sensible way of doing military procurement, as well as some of the high-tech stuff. Next one for me. Ombre Intelligence, the maritime risk management firm, says that Russian forces conducted an overnight drone attack on the port of Yuzhny in Ukraine. Now, we reported this yesterday. This is just outside Odessa in southern Ukraine. This is a separate attack. Ukrainian air defence shot down a number of drones over the city, and according to local sources, infrastructure providing power to shiploading cranes and grain terminal unloading mechanisms sustained damage, resulting in a power outage and a halt in cargo handling. Containers and cargo in the vicinity were also affected. Then Russia-aligned media said that Moscow had deployed 20 drones in the area. The Odessa governor said that 19 of those had been intercepted. Although there was damage to port infrastructure, no ships were said to have been damaged. Now, a lot's happening in the military diplomatic arena. This morning, I saw a press release. The leaders of Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway and Sweden issued a joint statement. So a lot of the Baltic Nordic countries, they said, "We stand firmly and fully behind Ukraine. Ukraine must be able to prevail against Russia's war of aggression to ensure a just and lasting peace. The outcome of the war will have fundamental and long-lasting effects on European and transatlantic security. Our priority now is to strengthen Ukraine. It goes on for a little bit, but essentially it's quite a punchy statement, which you might say, well, that's great. Where's the money? They are putting up the money. I mean, they are some of the largest per capita contributors of military assistance to Ukraine. I thought it was interesting they put that statement out, that joint statement out, on the eve of Munich and after the comments by Trump and Hegseth and what have you. Now, obviously, as I just said, it comes as the Munich Security Conference is getting underway today. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte here has had a number of meetings this morning already. He tweeted a few hours ago, "A strong NATO and a strong America go hand in hand. Thanks to US Vice President Jade Vance for the discussion this morning on Europe stepping up on defence spending, working closely to boost defence production and doing all we can to ensure a lasting peace in Ukraine." And interestingly, I see on the plan for Munich tomorrow at 12:30, just after lunchtime, local time, there's going to be a panel discussion with Mr. Rutte that's titled Pay or Pray, as in P-R-E-Y, although maybe the A-Y would work as well. Pay or Pray, NATO, the US and transatlantic security. So that will be an interesting panel to watch. We're going to have a report on Monday from James Rothwell, who's going to be at the Munich Security Conference. Now then, Francis, let's have a chat. Former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he said on the floor of the House of Commons yesterday,
"Can I ask the Minister if she agrees with me that in this new world and in the event of any peace deal, that the United Kingdom and its European allies must lead in providing Ukraine with military support and potentially military presence across land, air and sea to give Ukraine confidence that any peace will endure?"
Francis, I have two questions for you. Number one, do you agree with him? And number two, do you think he listens to the pod? Because that's exactly the bit about military presence, not sort of, wrapped up presence. Do you think he listens to the pod? Because we were talking about that yesterday. But Francis, what's your take on those two questions?
Well, thanks, Dom. Yes, an interesting intervention there from the former British Prime Minister just as the critical Munich Security Conference begins. As we discussed yesterday, the formalising of the shift in American foreign policy has left Europe reeling, and various countries and leaders are now setting out their stalls. Today, the current British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has spoken to President Zelensky, we understand, and offered concrete support for as long as is needed, saying the UK is willing to step up and that there could be no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. He added, Ukraine needs strong security guarantees, further legal aid and a sovereign future. And then it was followed by his boldest statement, which will immediately put him at odds with the US, it seems. The UK's commitment to Ukraine being on an irreversible path to NATO membership has not changed. Now, the Times of London has published some candid remarks from sources in the British Ministry of Defence for their reaction to the news of the past 48 hours. Says one, "Some of us were saying the Ukrainians haven't fought for 3 years, lost their sons and daughters, only to be cut out of the discussions on their future. If I was them, I would give Trump the same message as those on Snake Island. Go F yourself." I didn't say it, Dom. I didn't say the word. Now, the major question remains unchanged, however. Is the British government really prepared to reshape its energy policy, cut welfare and departmental spending to fund a dramatic uplift in defence? This is hard to see in a government that is prioritising domestic issues. Now, the French President Macron, too, has come out swinging. He's described Trump's remarks as an electroshock that should force Europe to secure its own future as well as Ukraine's, championing the need for Europe to muscle up on defence, his word, and the economy. He also insisted that only Zelensky should negotiate on behalf of his country, warning that allowing peace that is a capitulation would be bad news for everyone, including the US. The only question at this stage is whether Putin is genuinely, sustainably and credibly willing to agree to a ceasefire on that basis, he added. After that, it's up to the Ukrainians to negotiate with Russia. He then said we all need to stay collectively vigilant. The US's role is to restart this dialogue and take the initiative because Trump brought an element of strategic disruption. But Zelensky alone must discuss territorial and sovereignty issues. It is up to the international community, with a specific role for the Europeans, to discuss security guarantees and, more broadly, the security framework for the entire region. That is where we have a role to play. This is Europe's moment to accelerate and execute. It has no choice. It is running out of road. This model we have had, that you have the Chinese market as an outlet, you have the American umbrella for our security, and you have cheap Russian gas to be able to produce, forget all three. And then Macron ended by saying, in typical French fashion, I still believe. I love the humanism of the Renaissance and the philosophy of the Enlightenment. It is what made us, and I don't think those ideas are old-fashioned. I think, on the contrary, we have to reinvent them. Touché, but deeds not words, Macron, deeds not words. To Munich then, where the EU's foreign policy chief and former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas has made it clear that her views are, before talks begin, pretty blunt. Russia recklessly attacked again the Chernobyl nuclear site, she said. Such attacks on civilian nuclear sites are unacceptable. It shows once again that Russia is not looking for peace. Now, as Dom just said, our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell is there and is updating our live blog throughout the day. He's just posted, and I quote, "It's an extraordinarily chilly, snowy morning here in Munich, where world leaders are meeting for talks that will focus on how to end the war. J.D. Vance, US Vice President, has already arrived here and is due to speak at the conference around lunchtime. He's also due to meet with Zelensky, who is speaking at a panel today, and then give a keynote speech on Saturday. That meeting is not on the conference agenda and will presumably take place in private due to its sensitive nature. Trump claims that a Russian delegation has been sent to Munich for talks with Ukraine on ending the war. So where are they? Well, the short answer is nowhere to be seen. The conference organisers have confirmed to the BBC that there is no Russian delegation in attendance. It is possible that Russia has secretly sent an unofficial delegation to Munich, perhaps under assumed identities, or perhaps it has sent mediators on its behalf. Other possible explanations would be that Trump misspoke, or the claim of a Russian delegation being in Munich is simply a ploy to make Ukraine feel under pressure to include Moscow in any future negotiations. So James Rothwell there, and do check out the live blog later on and throughout the day, because he is, as I say, there and is covering all the latest developments. One thing we do know is that the new US Secretary of State Pete Hegseth invited political activist Jack Posobiec to join him, who has been tweeting from the summit this morning. This is a man who suggested that Bucha never happened, pushed the biolabs conspiracy from the first few months of the war, and retweets Putin's favourite intellectual, Dugin. Now, one of the major question marks following the recent revelations is what has happened to the US's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg. We understand he is expected to meet with officials at the summit, despite his talking up a strategy of maximum pressure on Russia and building trust in Europe and Kyiv being so suddenly and sharply dismissed. There is a more hawkish contingent in the Trump team preparing, or was preparing, a more robust policy. Those reports were accurate, but clearly other decisions were made and that team has been overshadowed. Trump underscored yesterday that more implicitly in remarks about Munich. He said Russia is going to be there with our people. Ukraine is also invited. He also reiterated the historical, well, it's just not true, that Biden was the one that started the war because he said Ukraine could join NATO. He also implied that he had warned Ukraine it was a bad war to get into, despite the fact that it was Russia that started it. Then he threw in a new idea, saying that Russia should return to the G7 group of advanced economies and that expelling them was a mistake when Crimea was annexed. I'd love to have them back, he said. So clearly, the Russian charm offensive on Trump behind closed doors has worked wonders.
Thanks, Francis. And now over to Jade McGlynn for our newest segment, summarising recent resistance activities in the occupied territories. Welcome back, Jade.
So thank you for having me again. And this week I'm going to be talking about events from the 31st of January to the 13th of February 2025. And the resistance continues in the occupied territories. There were 4 successful operations, mostly in eastern Ukraine. But definitely the most high-profile strike, though carried out by Ukrainian resistance, happened outside of eastern Ukraine, and it was the assassination of Armen Sargsyan, who was the head of the so-called DNR battalion, and he was assassinated in Moscow. So who was Mr. Sargsyan? He was originally a criminal boss from Horlivka, which is a large town just above Donetsk. And he was the founder of the Armenian volunteer battalion called Arbat, which fights in the Russian army, as well as the president of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic Boxing Federation. And he was assassinated by the Mariupol Sprotiv group via an explosion in the Alia Parusa hotel. And as well as Mr. Sargsyan, also Oleg Kaspirovich, who was a Ukrainian traitor, collaborator who went over to the Russians from Crimea. And he himself was also formerly a deputy commander of a special forces unit in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but at this point was working as Mr. Sargsyan's bodyguard. In addition to this, we saw another successful explosion in Makiyivka, and I'm going to come on to the cases in a second. But one of the things I wanted to draw attention to just before I do was how we're continuing to see crackdowns. So the Russian occupation forces continue to tighten control over the temporarily occupied territories in direct response to this resistance. So in early February, we saw additional checkpoints being set up at the entrances to Luhansk region. And it's about controlling movement, but also about trying to forcibly mobilize any men of conscription age who are then detained and packed off. And there's also been a wave of mass repression in Crimea with inspections, stop and searches going through phones for local residents, collecting information, and so on. But as I was getting at, the resistance still continues. Perhaps it does require them to use quite creative methods of fighting the occupation authorities. So not just sabotage and assassinations, but for example, in Mariupol, non-violent resistance have been distributing leaflets with QR codes, which leads to a bot to help Ukraine. And they've been distributing them physically to mailboxes. And also as well, just a reminder that there's lots of things that happen that are not covered. I can only really give out information that is kind of secure, is already open. But just to give you a hint, there's a lot of resistance that goes on that I'm not aware of course, or that even if I were aware of, could not be confirmed or shared. And as a good example of that, it's interesting to think about the recent ban put on Russian soldiers going to Melitopol and Berdyansk, which are two cities in the occupied Zaporizhia region, so on the Black Sea, and it's where soldiers used to go when they were on leave. However, they kept on dying whilst they were there on leave. And whilst the official kind of military line is, it's drunken fights over women, many of the locals believe that actually it's the activities of the Ukrainian underground. I don't know, of course, either way. I'm sure there have definitely been some drunken fights over women, certainly from my experience of speaking to drunken Russian soldiers before 2014. But let's go on to the case studies before we open up traumatic memories of traveling on trains for Yekaterinburg. The first case was on the 1st of February, and that was in the Zaporizhia region, and used the Sprotiv Priazovia, so the Azov region resistant, named after the sea. And this was about poisoning. So this used to be very common in the occupied territories, but then the Russian military sent a top-down command that soldiers shouldn't be fraternizing really with locals at all, and instead kind of collaborators were put in place as the sort of middlemen who dealt with the local population. But every now and again, people's guards slip, and there was poisonings that were carried out through pies. We don't actually have pictures of the poisonings having happened, but we do have pictures of the poison, the kind of pirishki, like little sort of pies, dumplings, apparently successfully. The second case was carried out by the Free Donetsk group, and it was a targeting of a military vehicle. It's not clear. I mean, the Free Donetsk group are traditionally quite tight-lipped, and so there is no visual documentation. It has been reported by 2 channels, but this one I would just put a slight warning on. There is an image of the military vehicle, but not afterwards. So I just want to put a slight warning line on that one, but I wanted to include it since generally Free Donetsk, the Svobodny Donetsk channel doesn't say things lightly. The third case we've discussed, and that was carried out by Mariupol Sprotiv, the Mariupol Resistance, in Moscow on the 3rd of February. Plentiful evidence there. And the fourth case took place in Makiivka on the 8th of February, and Makiivka is a sort of industrial town in Donetsk region. So again, it's pretty close to the city of Donetsk. It's about 15 kilometers, about sort of 9-10 miles away from Donetsk. And there was an explosion there carried out by the Novoazovsk resistance. You can see in the videos that are available that there's at least one person dead, and that is before you look at the huge fire. So clearly there would have been several people affected, and yes, very high profile collaborators, though particular names have not been shared. Discussing all of this, it makes it quite hard to not think as well about President Trump's comments yesterday. And clearly what he's discussing is not a detailed or concrete plan, but it does make me think, in light of these cases that continue, if there were a deal, Russia would need so many soldiers still in order to man the contact lines, but also to deal with what's going on behind the contact lines in the occupied territories. They're clearly still not pacified, to use that horrible term. And I do find it interesting that the Special Forces of Ukraine have gone very big on a new recruitment campaign for the underground this week. And there was also another story that links to the occupied territories, not so much to the resistance. And that was to do with Trump-related news. And there was a great article in New Voice of Ukraine this morning about China's involvement in extracting all those shiny minerals that the White House is interested in. And essentially, private Chinese firms are developing factories and industrial infrastructure in Russian-occupied Ukraine, especially sort of Donetsk and Luhansk regions where there's trillions and other forms of minerals. And according to New Voice, there's at least a dozen Chinese companies involved in supplying equipment and materials. And it's pretty suggestive of China's interest in securing these resources. There's quite a lot of data there from the sort of Russian media or different like occupation administration announcements. So it's not hidden. And of course, China is a wily geopolitical actor. They understand the situation. But I think if the White House is interested in accessing Ukraine's post-war industrial assets or its riches underground, then the White House might wish to hurry up before Beijing takes all the best bets.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that update, Jade. I had one final question connected to the updates of yesterday, which is, do you think that morale in the occupied territories will be impacted by the negotiation talk of the last 48 hours or so, or do you think it doesn't really change that much in terms of their experience and their defiance?
I think morale has already been impacted, to be honest. I have to say, I found the reaction, certainly from my friends in Ukraine, to Trump's comments, they didn't really seem to care compared to my friends in the West. Probably won't come as a surprise to anybody that I don't really talk about much other than the war, and therefore do not have friends who talk about much other than the war. So, of course, it's not going to have a positive impact on morale, but I don't think anybody at this point who's involved in the resistance in the occupied territories was labouring under the impression that their territories were going to be liberated anytime soon. And ultimately, I've heard some people, for example, Stanislav Asyev, the writer who was tortured in the so-called Dearnley and then fought on the front lines, but is now a veteran. He was injured, who was talking about the case study of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, there are lots of problems with comparing that, and I definitely don't want to get into Armenian and Azeri claims over Nagorno-Karabakh, but the analogy he was drawing is that Azerbaijan, they kept that territory in their cultural memory and in their society. And then 30 years on, when they were in a position to, they took it back. And I thought it was an interesting parallel in terms of the pacing and in terms of, that the resistance can't fight this as a sprint. This is a marathon. And dear Lord, I think we all hope that it won't be 30 years of occupation, but I think the occupation is not going to end soon. And when you think about Russia's key goal, which is to eradicate Ukrainian national identity as such from these regions, the Ukrainian identity that it projects, it has its own kind of perverse, deformed vision of what Ukrainians should be, then it's really important. What the resistance is doing takes on additional importance because they're constantly showing that Russia has not achieved its war aims, and they are keeping Ukrainian identity alive in the territory, so that there is a hope for the future. But that's a lot to ask of anybody, and of course morale is not going to have been improved.
Now, let's just pause for a moment. We're hearing that Pete Hegseth has said that European countries need to invest now in defence because, in his words, it's not possible to assume that the United States' presence on the continent will last forever. Now, that's another huge statement to make, given there are around 100,000 American troops on European soil. I've visited many of them. I worked alongside many of them. Although don't go and have the coffee in Stuttgart at AFRICOM headquarters. It's awful. But Hegseth also gave some other interviews yesterday. Could you summarise them, Francis?
Yes, well, he's had a rough 24 hours on the podium. One reporter asked him outright, "You have focused on what Ukraine is giving up. What concessions will Putin be asked to make?" And Hegseth replied, "I'd start by saying the arguments that have been made that somehow coming to the table right now is making concessions to Putin, I reject that at its face." He then seemed to row back that his statement about NATO membership being off the table for Ukraine, he said everything is on the table. So many are now asking, does that mean we should ignore everything Hegseth did yesterday? And there's a clear contradiction in the reasoning here. On the one hand, he's saying that the US will broker peace in Ukraine, whilst at the same time saying that the US wants nothing to do with European defence. He then referred to Trump as the leader of the free world. But as you said yesterday, Dom, how can the US still use the moniker leader of the free world if it states explicitly that from now on it's acting America first and its own core interests? Perhaps the most extraordinary exchange, though, was the following. Are you ready for a bit of role play, Dom? You can be the proper journalist, and I'll be Hegseth.
For once,
go on.
Right. Okay. So I'm the journalist, and you're Hegseth. Right. Okay. Because this went so well last time. Right. So here we go. So just to be clear, you think values don't matter in war?
Look, values are great, but you can't exactly fight off the left with values.
Tell that to the French resistance, who fought Nazis with nothing but belief before they had weapons, or to Poland, where underground fighters kept their nation alive despite being occupied by the world's biggest armies.
I'm just saying, when it comes down to it, strength wins, not ideals.
Then explain how the US lost in Vietnam, why the Soviets collapsed after Afghanistan, or how Afghanistan itself fought off 3 empires. Firepower alone doesn't mean victory. Ask Russia, stuck in Ukraine despite superior weapons.
Well, military power still matters more than words.
And yet words, values, are why people choose to fight in the first place. Ukraine didn't stand because of weapons. They stood because they refused to be ruled.
So you're saying values win wars?
I'm saying values make armies fight harder, longer and with more purpose. Without them, all the firepower in the world means nothing. Just ask the British Empire, the Soviets, or soon enough, Putin.
An extraordinary exchange, I'm sure you'll agree, which reveals so much. Can't help but think that Kennedy would be weeping. It was him who said, and I pulled the quote out, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty." How times have changed.
Indeed, Francis, and yet again, thank you for that. I look forward to the next one. Now, anyway, yesterday we talked about what options are available to the US. I'm going to read now some insights from a well-placed expert who wishes to remain anonymous. But our expert friend says Europe can quickly ramp up production of drones, from small FPV to Shahed and longer range strike. The answer isn't how many or what kinds, but yes, no matter how many are produced, it won't be enough. Our expert says the 70mm, the 2.75-inch and gun-based air defence has shown its effectiveness, i.e. just chucking lead in the air. That's my words, chucking lead in the air rather than anything more glitzy and expensive. Shown its effectiveness and can be scaled up. Artillery can't be ignored, and gas masks along with basic infantry gear cannot be forgotten. However, Europe needs to consider how it can set the post-war theatre, whether or not it still sits at the negotiating table. Europe still buys massive quantities of Russian oil and gas and still exports billions in goods via transshipments. But even if an immediate embargo happened, that doesn't guarantee it isn't rolled back. In military circles, you often hear about punishment campaigns such as the bombing of cities in World War II or Russia's destruction of the Ukrainian power grid. There are also counter-industry campaigns such as the industrial bombing in Europe and the aerial mining of Chinese ports. When the US and allies lose war games, this is still our expert speaking, when the US and allies lose war games, planners often try to focus on blockade punishment campaigns. However, none of these are guaranteed to succeed. An alternative is a theatre-setting operation where military industry and hard-to-replace critical or dual-use infrastructure is destroyed to buy time for allies to rearm post-war. The most well-known case is when the British sunk the French fleet at the beginning of World War II. Ukraine has already started this by hitting refineries, as it is also hitting military production facilities. Europe giving Ukraine better reach to take out Russian bombers and surface-to-air missiles is one category I would add. Any munition factory and first-tier industrial precursor would be on the target list too. Finally, even if the war ends, the grey zone attacks are likely to increase, as they steadily have since the 2008 Estonia hack. That was the massive cyber attack on Estonia, much of which, this is me talking now, sorry, that's why Estonia is one of the leaders in national cybersecurity today, because of that 2008 attack. Back to our expert. The expert says cable cutting, assassination attempts such as the attempt on the chief exec of Rheinmetall, and sabotage such as the German corvette sabotage this week will all grow more frequent. Only an unambiguous defeat on the West's terms can dictate an end to grey zone attacks. So that was our expert speaking. But Francis, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting discussion point, isn't it? Well, I would just add that, as I said yesterday, at some point reality is going to for the United States. The pathway to a lasting peace is simply not there yet. And don't just take my word for it, as Sam Green, Director of Democratic Resilience at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, has posted today. Washington and Moscow remain miles apart on what even a minimally acceptable settlement would entail. For Putin, an acceptable deal would need to do four things. 1, keep Ukraine out of NATO. 2, provide sanctions relief. 3, leave Russia in control of escalation. And 4, neuter Europe. The White House, by contrast, takes a minimalist approach, simply wanting the fighting to stop. While the administration has already signalled a veto of Ukraine's NATO accession, that in and of itself is unlikely to satisfy Putin. Which brings me to the key point in all of this. Putin isn't interested in a rapid end to the war. His economy and political legitimacy are built on this war and on conflict with the West more broadly. Pivoting away from that would be costly. What Putin does want, however, is to lock the US into a lengthy political process that will A, disincentivize further support for Ukraine, and B, provide a smorgasbord. I can never pronounce that word. Smorgasbord?
You're the one that went to Sweden.
Yeah, I know. I should know that, shouldn't I? Yeah, but they didn't offer me a smorgasbord, they offered me porridge. Anyway, that's another. Of opportunities to extract interim concessions, all while leaving Russia free to keep fighting.
I like porridge.
So interesting reflections there. And then also Professor Lawrence Freedman in the Financial Times also offers another interesting perspective which speaks to this theme. He says Putin is no doubt delighted to be treated with respect by Trump. But without these other demands being met, he will not have achieved his war aims. He does not agree with American ideas for an early ceasefire, largely based on the current line of contact between the two sets of forces, to be followed by negotiations or a longer-term peace settlement. To be sure, this would allow him to hold a large chunk of Ukrainian land, but there would also be the prospect of Ukraine reconstituting its forces with Western support to return to the fight later. Russia would need to subsidize and police occupied territory, much of which has been ruined by a series of destructive battles, and defend a long border. That is why, this is still Professor Freedman, that is why Putin has demanded that a peace settlement that allows him to achieve his war aims of the subjugation of Ukraine be agreed prior to any ceasefire. He wants to deal with what he considers the root causes of the situation, i.e. the development of a European security order unfavourable to Russia since the end of the Cold War. There is no reason to suppose that Trump is interested in any of this. Hegseth's comments suggest that as far as the administration is concerned, the Russians should talk to the Europeans about the future of Europe. Negotiations to deal with all of the outstanding issues could take many months. And with the memory still fresh of what abandoning Afghanistan in August 2021 did to Joe Biden's ratings, there are limits to how far Trump can push Kyiv into the loss of more sovereignty and territory, even if he wished to. His officials have said that he does not. And then Lawrence Freedman concludes by saying as follows: most awkward for Putin is that his bargaining position is not that strong. Russia has enjoyed the military initiative since late 2023, and it has made incremental gains, but these have yet to reach the boundaries of the claimed territories and have come at extraordinarily high cost. The campaign against critical infrastructure, intended to leave Ukraine shivering and in the dark through the winter, has thus far failed. And Ukraine has taken initiatives of its own. So, as the negotiating teams can start to engage, Putin has to work out whether he can walk away from his maximalist demands. Perhaps he could agree to a ceasefire, but only with a strict negotiating timetable for a final settlement and some early relief on sanctions. Maybe he could concede Ukraine EU membership. But if Ukraine stays independent and armed, he will have failed. Should Putin end up being blamed for the failure of this big push for peace, he might find that even Trump is ready to step up support for Kyiv and impose more sanctions on Russia. That's my view too, for what it's worth. But I would agree with you as well, Dom, what you were saying yesterday, that now is the moment really for Europe to be thinking more boldly. It should be doing something to upend the table, like, as you were suggesting, placing perhaps contingents of troops in Kyiv to make it very, very clear that Kyiv will stand regardless of what negotiations are being discussed at moments in Munich. But whether there is the willpower in Europe for that yet remains to be seen.
Francis, it's February the 14th. It's Valentine's Day. I want to ask you your secret crush. Now, I think I know this person, and I think I've met her. And perhaps if I'd known that you'd be on the prowl one day, I could have warned her off. But who is your secret crush?
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to a very special lady, someone who's never let me down, who says all the right things and has been here since the start. Kaya Callas, will you be my Valentine?
God, that's horrific. Nat, do you want to know mine?
Yeah, well, go on. I'm dreading to hear what yours is, Dom. Go on, tell me.
Well, I'll give you a clue. I had dinner with this individual just before Christmas.
Does your wife know about this?
Never mind that. I had dinner with this individual just before Christmas.
Okay.
This person has worn a uniform. That might be what sold it to me. Any ideas?
No, carry on.
Okay, some clues as to the nationality. The country this person comes from is home to the largest ancient castle in the world. Any ideas? No?
A castle?
A castle, yeah.
Ancient? Okay. There weren't castles in the ancient period, really.
Okay, listen to me. A chemist from this person's country invented soft contact lenses. Any ideas yet?
No, carry on.
And finally, if I did ever get to meet this individual personally, because when I said I had dinner with them, there were 200 other people there as well. It was a conference, but I like to think our eyes met across the table. If I had dinner with this individual, we would be drinking Pilsner Urquell.
Okay, all right. So now we're check. Okay.
Any ideas? Cool Santa. Petropavl. President of Czech Republic.
He's that man has good facial hair. I'll give you that.
He's a great guy. Which one of us do you think has got better chance with our secret diplomatic Valentine's crush?
Definitely me. 100%.
Paul Heslop is Senior Mine Action Advisor for the United Nations in Ukraine. In a wide-ranging discussion about his work, he described the scale of the task, how technology is helping to make Ukraine safer, and what the priorities of work might be after any future ceasefire. Here is our conversation. I'm delighted to be joined now by Paul Heslop, the Senior Mine Action Advisor for the United Nations in Ukraine. Paul, thank you so much for joining Ukraine the Latest today. Could you just give us an outline of your work, please, and the scale of the task in Ukraine today?
Thanks, Dominic. It's a privilege to be on this podcast. I listen to it on a daily basis from Kyiv, so it's great to have the chance to talk with you. My role here is the Senior Technical Advisor related to humanitarian mine action and bomb disposal in Ukraine, so helping clear up the mess that's been made by the thousands or hundreds of thousands, even millions of explosive items that have been fired into Ukraine over the last 15 years, and particularly since the full-scale invasion. The scale, as you can imagine, is huge. I mean, the numbers involved, even just in terms of artillery munitions, numbers have ranged from 10 to 40,000 a day. If you're looking at a 10 to 30% fail rate, you're looking at between 1,000 and 1,200 items a day across 1,000 days of conflict. You're looking at millions and millions of unexploded bombs in the east of the country, spreading from the border on the north down to the Black Sea. So we're looking at a very large task in terms of unexploded ordnance, but then in addition to that, there's been the widespread use of anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines. So my role here really is to help the Ukrainian government find an appropriate response to deal with that, to help them build their capacity to clear and destroy those items, and to also work with the international community and donor countries to mobilize the funds to pay for it.
Thank you. And before I dial down into Ukraine specifically, just a brief word, if you're able to, on how wide this work for the United Nations is actually conducted. Is it across all the world in the recent conflicts that folk will know?
Yeah, the UN has been involved in humanitarian or mine action, as it's often referred to, since the early 90s. People will also have heard of organisations like the Halo Trust and MAG, Mines Advisory Group. And of course, the most probably famous image people have is of Diana visiting the minefield in 97. So the UN has been involved in probably every conflict since the 90s, ranging from Afghanistan to Iraq, down into Somalia, Mozambique, Angola, and even across into parts of Latin America like Colombia. So the UN has a lot of experience in working in the humanitarian mine action sector and has delivered successful projects across the globe. So it was almost inevitable that when the full-blown invasion took place in Ukraine, we would be asked to come in and try and assist the Ukrainian government, working with partners like Halo, MAG, and other international NGOs.
Thank you. Now, when we chatted a few days ago, you were describing to me the different types of land in Ukraine. That's the land that's Russian-held, the frontline area and the buffer zone around there, and the area that was previously occupied. You were talking about the different challenges they pose. Can you just sort of lay out that for us, please, and how you actually approach the task?
Obviously, the areas that are currently occupied by Russia, there is no access at all for any of the humanitarian actors from the Ukrainian side, and I believe very little from the other side. So the level of contamination and what's going on there, it's very difficult to tell. Obviously, the front line itself, which is probably between 1 and 5 kilometers wide, depending on the front line, again, running from the Belarus border right down to the Black Sea, is an active conflict area, and I don't think any humanitarian operator would want to be in there, but obviously that is something that is pretty much under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. Coming back from there, there is what is called a buffer zone, which is about 20 kilometres, and that's based mainly around the range of artillery. And within those 20 kilometres, the number of people who are living in that area is very limited. A few stubborn individuals who have refused to be evacuated, and the work that goes in there is still very much under the purview of the national authorities. So the brave men and women who work for state emergency services, the police EOD, and a special state transport service, which is an organisation that keeps the critical infrastructure going. So they're working in those areas in collaboration with the Ukrainian armed forces. And then outside of the buffer zone is where the humanitarian actors come into play, where the Ukrainian and international NGOs, non-government organisations, and some of the commercial players are working, as you say, on areas that were previously occupied and therefore may be mined or contaminated, or were mined or contaminated, although the Russians didn't occupy it. They were close enough that those areas came under artillery or cluster strikes. And of course, there are areas within that area that are still being hit. I mean, 2 nights ago in Ukraine, as you reported yesterday, a large number of items fired into Ukraine, some of which didn't explode and need to be cleared by the bomb disposal and EOD teams.
Now, talking about those EOD teams, how big are the teams working for the UN? I know that, as you say, you've got Halo and other NGOs as well, but how big is the UN footprint, and what's the working routine? How long do people do before they are able to get out of the country for a break, or what's the established working pattern?
Again, quite a good question. The UN itself does not actually do humanitarian demining for a number of reasons, one of which is it's not really a skill set that we have, and there are organisations like Halo Trust and MAG who are actually much better at doing the implementation. So we're often a conduit for the funds, so donors will fund UN trust funds, so there's the Ukraine Recovery Fund, the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, the Voluntary Trust Fund for Mine Action, and then various UN agencies have their own funds. And those funds are then channeled through a competitive process to demining organisations, or often we will discuss with different donor nations the direct grants to those implementing partners. So, the US government, the UK government, the EU may give a grant directly to an organisation like the Halo Trust and MPA. And we're working very closely with the government and the government authorities to identify the priority areas that need to be cleared, what will have the most economic impact or the most humanitarian impact, would allow early recovery, would allow energy infrastructure to be repaired, for example, bridges to be rebuilt, schools and hospitals. And then the actual clearance of those is undertaken either by the NGOs or through the government services. As I mentioned, there's 3 in particular, police, EOD, who are doing more of the counter-ID and the counter-terrorism stuff, state emergency services, who are tied into the fire services, and they often get called out, police, EOD, and their teams vary in size from 3 or 4 people through to about 15. And these are, when you're seeing news clips of where a strike has come in, and you can see, in effect, firefighters or men in some form of uniform, or men and women, they're the EOD guys who are out clearing these devices on a daily basis.
Now, on those teams, you mentioned the men there, and I'm thinking Ukrainian nationals in particular here. They, I presume, are exempt from military service whilst they are conducting these kind of activities. But you also say that a lot of the funding comes from outside. So, for example, has the anticipated reduction in funding through USAID, for example, is that going to have an impact on the ground? And if the NGOs have to lay off Ukrainian men of fighting age, or the draft age, 25 to 60, are they still exempt military service, or are they going to be scooped up and put in uniform and therefore further denuding the demining effort?
That is obviously one of our biggest concerns at the moment. The US was very generously funding about 30 to 35% of the funds that come into the mine action sector in Ukraine at the moment. And of course, everybody in Ukraine is very, very glad of that funding. Hopefully what we're seeing here is a pause rather than a removal. But to become a deminer, let alone an EOD operator, takes time and effort. The government had granted an exemption last year for people employed in demining so that they would not be conscripted. But our concern is that if the suspension of funding was to go on for a long period of time and we're not able to find replacement funding, then exemption could expire, and then in theory those men either to avoid conscription disappear, or they get conscripted, and even then if funding resumes, once they're conscripted or they're disappeared, that trained workforce that we've invested in so much over the last 2 or 3 years is gone. So we're very much hoping to hear that there has been an exemption granted for mine action in Ukraine, and that funding can resume as soon as possible, and those brave men and women can get back down on the ground and doing the job they're so good at doing.
Thank you. And I should say you use the term EOD, that's explosive ordnance disposal, unless I'm massively out of date. Is that correct?
Yeah. Bomb disposal, it's in this form.
Bomb disposal, brilliant. Now, again, when we were chatting, you were talking about how there's a lot of land that's either probably clear or wouldn't take a huge amount of work to clear, but there's the fear in the local society means that it has not been cleared, and that's impacting the amount of agricultural work that can go on, and that's having a direct impact on, as we would feel it here in London and elsewhere around the world, the price of our bread and Weetabix and God knows what else. So can you talk us through that chain of events?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think people, and I certainly didn't realise before I came to Ukraine, is how vast Ukraine is and how much of a contribution to the global economy, particularly global food security and global energy prices, Ukraine made, and the consequence of the conflict on both of those. There was a decision after the first successful counterattack, which drove a lot of Russian forces back up to the border in the north and back towards the east, that any areas that had been occupied by Russia had to be considered suspect. What that has meant is that we now have land that is contaminated, and for example, land on the front line is probably some of the most contaminated land we've seen in history, certainly since the Second World War in Europe. But there is also a lot of land that may or may not be contaminated, and that is maybe 100 to 1,000 times as much as the actual contaminated land. Now, clearing the contaminated land that is actually contaminated is going to be slow, expensive, and very dangerous. But in terms of the economic impact to the world, that's making, as you say, our Weetabix more expensive each day, or our fuel more expensive in the car, is the land that is not being used that could be used, but is because it's only suspected and is not actually contaminated. And so this is something, again, we're working very closely with the Ukrainian government to find ways to show no evidence of mines or no evidence of contamination, so that the farmers who are almost literally sat on the side of the field with their tractors ready to go can get in and plough and turn that land into corn and wheat and sunflowers and start again contributing to the Ukrainian economy, but more significantly help bring down global food prices. The Tony Blair Institute recently did a study that thinks that because of seed contamination and actual contamination, Ukraine's economy is affected adversely by over $11 billion a year, and it may be a drag of 4 to 5% on GDP growth. So, that is significant in Ukraine, but if that's also an effect on the global economy, clearly getting that land back into use as quickly as possible would be a benefit for everybody listening to this show and beyond.
It certainly would. Now, you use the word contamination quite a lot. There have been reports of use of if not actual chemical weapons, but riot control agents, crowd control agents that are covered by the Chemical Weapons Convention. Have you come across any such munitions in your work?
Not yet. Obviously, that is something that we will have to factor into for future clearance operations. And one thing that we've been advocating in terms of our partnership with the government entities that are doing this type of clearance is that they have the right protective equipment, gas masks and noddy suits, etc., the NBC gear that's required. But it will certainly be a planning consideration going forward. As far as I'm aware, all of the alleged use of those agents has been very much on the front line, so not even in the buffer zone. So that is an area that we have no access as humanitarians at all, so I'm not in a position to verify whether they have or haven't been used, but we are certainly planning on the eventuality that we may have to deal with that in the future if that area opens up to humanitarian operations.
Thank you. And you mentioned the equipment there, gas masks and suits and what have you. What equipment are you using? Are we still talking people on the belt buckle, digging into the earth, looking for these kind of things? How much is technology able to assist you in your work?
Yeah, at the end of the day, the most certain way to be sure that a piece of land has been cleared is, as you say, for a man or a woman to be on their hands and knees with a metal detector and a prodder and literally checking the ground inch by inch, metre by metre. Fortunately, there are ways that can make that process faster and more efficient. The use of machines, the use of animal detection systems. And one of the things that we've made big advances in Ukraine and I think will ultimately change the way that humanitarian demine operations around the world are used is the use of remote sensors and sensors mounted on drones and even satellite imagery. And we were able to use a combination of satellite imagery and some very basic AI photo interpretation with the Ministry of Economy and the State Emergency Services to assess that 30,000 square kilometres of land that may have been contaminated actually were not contaminated and was actively being used. 30,000 square kilometres is 30 billion square metres, or 20 times the contamination that's currently in Afghanistan. And that was able to be done in under 9 months at a very, very low cost per square metre. And so, yes, the Ukrainians are very open to adoption of new technology and using new sensors, new platforms to try and speed up this process. Actually, at an innovation conference today, sponsored by the European Union in Kyiv, where we're looking at new technologies and how that can be used. But a lot of it is, how do we manage the risk? How do we layer those technologies? And how do we create increased efficiency through it, rather than just spending money on shiny bits of kit that don't actually work?
Guy, I mean, it's just the scale of the task that I find absolutely extraordinary. I presume it's too glib a question to say, how long will it take to clear Ukraine? Because there'll be different priorities, I presume. If that's not a stupid question, please answer it. But just generally, what do you think the priorities would be after any ceasefire? A lot of talk at the moment about peace and what have you. I won't go into the detail of that. But post any ceasefire, what's the priority for your work?
Well, in terms of how long it will take, the answer is how long's a piece of string. I think, as always, what we've got to do is identify the priorities, and there are a lot of priorities. And again, one of the things we're working on with is a couple of, let's say, AI software companies with good GIS capabilities to actually look at the parcels of land that are potentially contaminated and seeing how to create automatic prioritization models to identify which land should be cleared first to give the biggest impact. So although it may take years or decades to remove the last mine, there's plenty of places in Europe still have contamination from the First and Second World War, to bring the impact from mines and UXO down to a manageable and acceptable level where we're not creating casualties on a regular basis and we're not seeing the economic impact of those devices and we're not affecting daily life, I think can be done probably within 10 years if the right resources continue to be provided both from the international community and from the Treasury of Ukraine. So it is a massive task, but it's a manageable task if we go at it in the right way and we appreciate how to manage risk. Can we reduce that risk? Can we remove that risk? Can we mitigate it? Or how do we accept it? And then we have the right tools for prioritization and adopting new technologies as they come online that are appropriate, or even looking at old technologies and using them in a new way or combining it. In terms of what do we do on ceasefire plus one or two, I mean, the first one is obviously going to be depending on where a demarcation line is set, whether, as Ukraine would like, back to 2014 borders or something else, would be to understand what that line is and what's on either side of that line. And particularly if there's going to be a lot of returns into those areas, so people have been internally displaced or refugees coming back, we'd obviously want to make sure that they can come back safely. But probably more importantly still is if they're coming back, they will need access to critical infrastructure like power, water, education, health. Are the roads safe to drive on? So there would be a lot of emphasis on creating a safe environment for them to return. And I think we'd be doing a lot of work with the telephone engineers, the electrical engineers, the water and sanitation people to make sure when they deploy to fix that infrastructure, the explosive hazard is removed or mitigated as much as possible. And then again, when people come back to their homes, to their communities, they have risk education and they know how to report, how to avoid a hazard, or if they see a hazard, how to report it and to deal with it. One of the other concerns, having been involved in peace operations for many years, is, you've got hundreds of thousands of men who are currently heavily armed, and what do we do to make sure that those weapons are secured safely and that weapons that are unserviceable or dangerous are stored and ultimately destroyed, that we create an environment that they are supported in the best way as they come home. And another issue is there's an awful lot of amputees. How do we help Ukraine prepare for dealing with possibly up to 50,000 young men who've lost one or more limbs and have to be reintegrated into society? And in a society where actually the people who look after them will be probably their mothers, their sisters, their wives, their girlfriends, their daughters. How do we help those women prepare and they're ready to be able to deal with the returning veterans, some who have some horrific injuries and others who have just had to live on the front line for a couple of years, which is no small thing itself. So there's going to be an awful lot of work that we need to get in place in terms of weapon management, ammunition storage, demobilization process, preparing civilian population, preparing the veterans themselves, as well as clearing all of the UXO ordnance and contamination that is literally across the country.
Paul, thank you so much for chatting to us today. It's a hugely impressive task that you're undertaking. Thank you for doing what you do. Just before we go, is there anything else that we've not talked about today that you think needs to be brought to the attention of the public?
I think as always, people will often look at these tasks and say, it's so big, is it really worth trying to do it? And I think the answer is that we've shown in many other countries over the years that tasks that in the early 90s in countries like Mozambique and Angola, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, Cambodia, it looks impossible, but actually huge progress can be made if there's a continued effort and if there's continued support from the international community, particularly from governments, and there is a will to solve it. And I think in Ukraine, there's certainly a will from the Ukrainian side to solve it, but I would really ask the international community to please continue to provide the financial support. And then the other thing I would just like to really acknowledge the bravery and commitment of the Ukrainian men and women who go out every day, as we said, on their hands and knees, and they're clearing these devices and they're working in some very difficult conditions at the moment. It's bloody cold, and they're making their community safe and they're preparing the country for the next phase. And I can only acknowledge their bravery and their commitment to rebuilding Ukraine.
Paul, thank you from a sub-zero Kyiv today. Thank you so much for chatting to Ukraine the latest.
Thank you.
Do join us again on Monday when we'll be hearing from James Rothwell from the Munich Security Conference. A lot going on this weekend. Just take it easy, folks. Take it one step at a time. There's going to be a lot of red meat. We just need to get through it and not get indigestion. We'll see you on Monday for a wrap-up of the whole weekend and what we make of it. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph on X so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.